This is Rod White for Mining Network, and again I'm graced with the company of Mark Selby, who's en route to becoming the nickel sulphide spokesman for the Western world through the company Canada Nickel. We had our first interview 2 weeks ago, just after Canada Nickel did the big deal with Agnico Eagle. And within 2 weeks, Canada Nickel did a very important investment with Samsung, one of the world's leading battery manufacturers. So Mark, this is a pretty major recognition for Canada Nickel, which currently is a 290 million company with a net present value of 3.5 billion Canadian. What are these big investors seeing that the retail and asset managers are not seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, having Samsung come in is our third major endorsement. We've got Anglo, who came in about a year ago, Agnico Eagle, and now Samsung SDI. I think with these bulk tonnage ultramafics, there's been sort of two things holding some institutional investors back. So the first off is just, again, this is a relatively new type of deposit. Mount Keith has been mined in Western Australia for the last 30 years, but there have not been a number of these. So sometimes investors are hesitant to get into new types of mining operation. But when the fact that you've got Anglo American and Agnico Eagle. Anglo is one of the 5 largest mining companies globally, and Agnico Eagle is the largest mining company in Canada. If they're coming to the table, would suggest that they're pretty comfortable that this is a deposit type and potential operation that they would like to get some exposure to. The second big pushback that a lot of investors have is really around what this sort of the headline risk around Indonesia flooding the market with nickel. Again, Samsung SDI is an Asian battery maker. If Indonesia was going to supply everything the world needed, they wouldn't bother spending time over the last 2 years having these conversations with us, and getting to this transaction, taking an equity stake in us, value in our project. They've got the option to buy 10% of the project for 100 million US, which would put a value of 1.4 billion Canadian, again, a fraction of our current market cap on it. So, if these people who are in the industry are putting their money where their mouth is, most retail and institutional investors, should really pay attention to what's going on with Canada Nickel. And oh, by the way, in addition to Crawford, we have 20 plus targets in the region, and we think we're on unlocking an entire Timmins nickel district here.
Mark, I think it's useful to take the perspective of the EV manufacturers. And in Asia, where are they going to go for nickel sulphide? Because they need nickel sulphide for the batteries. Nickel laterite or nickel sulphide historically has looked after the stainless steel requirements, but we've got a very big change on our hands, because what happened, as you were saying, Indonesia, it's actually Indonesia and the Philippines have kind of swamped the market with nickel laterites, but nickel laterites aren't what you need for the technology which is applied in America or in Europe for EV vehicles. China is swamping the market with EV vehicles which are being bought in at a much lower price, because we can't see yet BMW, Volkswagen, Ford, Chrysler competing, because they don't have the source of supply. And the big supply source was Western Australia. When you were young, it was Sudbury, and Canada has got the most suitable geological endowment for nickel sulphides in the world. So if you are an off-taker, why wouldn't you go to Canada in preference to anywhere else.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, that's what we've seen now with Samsung SDI with us. There's another big bulk ultramafic deposit out in British Columbia. They had signed earlier an offtake agreement with Outokumpu, who's in the stainless steel industry in Europe. And so, the big plus for the deposits we have, one, they're large scale. So, what they're looking for North America and Europe is large scale sources of nickel. What we expect to see just from the battery plants that are already under construction, by the early 2030s, you should see nickel demand, in North America triple from where it's been, over the last 15 years or so.
Is this by 2030? When's it going to triple?
Within the next decade. So by the early 2030s, we'll need triple the nickel. There'll be triple the nickel demand in North America, from where it's sat over the last 15, 20 years, driven primarily by the EV sector, but as well by onshoring of different industrial processes, that used to be made somewhere else in the world and are now coming back, to the United States. So, the key piece here is, number one, they want large scale local sources of nickel. Two, all the nickel laterite that you were just talking about, most of it's produced with a very large carbon footprint because they use coal-fired power. They use a lot of coal to turn that laterite ore into metal. And the type of deposit we have, not only and where it's located, we can design an operation with a low carbon footprint to start with because we have access to low carbon electricity, but it's hosted in rock that allow us, and we've developed a process that allows us to capture and store over 35 tons of CO2 per ton of nickel we produce and have a net negative carbon footprint of 30 tons of CO2 per ton of nickel. And again, that's got a significant amount of interest, from a number of automakers, who really do care about their environmental footprint. The other part, most of these operations in Indonesia are Chinese controlled and don't necessarily, stack up with Western safety standards. We've had 2 smelter incidents alone in the last 3 weeks here in Indonesia. Unfortunately, 20 people were killed. On the first one, thankfully, it doesn't seem to be anybody was killed in this last incident. So again, car companies who care about the brand don't want to be associated with this kind of, environmental, social risk, that these kinds of operations generate.
Can I bring in Katrina? Because what is it that what do the governments want? How do you deliver the decarbonisation needed to build electric vehicles? What do the governments want and what does America need?
Well, I think, this is quite evident with all these battery plants getting built in the US and in Canada, and the government putting so much support to build these plants both in Canada and the US. Samsung, I was reading Samsung and Stellantis, they announced that they're building 2 battery plants in Indiana, and one is set to be in production in 2025. The second is set to be in production in 2027. And one thing to note is there's very little nickel produced in the United States. So the only primary nickel producing mine in the U.S. is the Eagle mine, and that's operated by Lundin Mining. And that's scheduled to close before end of the decade. So I think that the U.S. will be looking to Canada to help meet some of those supply shortfalls, which is where I think we're quite well positioned to help meet those demand requirements.
Well, they can't have nickel laterite, which is what's on offer. How do they get the nickel sulphide based on the production now and the outlook? Because nickel prices are at a multi-year low, which is not helping to develop new projects. But the government, to meet the requirements of the IRA, the government has to prioritise not low carbon footprint projects. And I'm a little bit puzzled as to why there are not more. I can think of 3 big projects that are in North America that should be activated, but you're the only taxi on the rank. And I think that's pretty important for the big off-takers. And Sumitomo they've reached out to British Columbia, but the infrastructure, the government support and everything you need, including the workforce, is there in the Timmins camp. And I'm Australian, and so I grew up seeing fly-in, fly-out operations. And when you're in Timmins, it's all there. Everything's there. The rail's there. The power, which is extremely low carbon power, is there. You're in the right geology in terms of the carbon footprint. There is nothing that meets government requirements more than the company that you people represent, Canada Nickel. It'll take 3 years for anybody else to catch up to where you are now.
No, exactly. I mean, the two big things for us, one you highlighted there is our wonderful location, in Timmins, where we do have access to all the major infrastructure is already in place. Most mining projects these days are in more remote locations. We have to spend, 18 months and several $billion to build the infrastructure before you even start building the mining project itself. In our case, it's all right there. We actually have to move some of it out of the way to build the operation, which is a good problem to have. And the second piece is, we've been advancing this project, at a record pace. We started the company just in 2019. In just over 4 years, we've gone from fifth drill hole to feasibility study on the project, and we're about halfway through the permitting process. So, we're targeting receipt of permits by mid-2025, and we look to be in production by the end of 2027, which, to my knowledge, puts us about 3 years or 4 years ahead at the earliest of any of our competitors of any scale. So, as you said, we're in the driver's seat in terms of, if a major user wants to have significant quantities of nickel, before the end of this decade, we're one of the few choices, or the only real choice of scale in North America.
Well, I think the point Katrina made earlier is rather important about the life expectancy for the Eagle mine. From 2027, there's another off-taker needs to have nickel. Now, you got Samsung's invested, they're in the box seat for offtake, but they're guaranteed 10%, but they could have 30% on terms to be advised after you've done your EIS and after you've up to the financing. But you've got a number of off-takers in Japan and Korea that are not going to go to Russia for their nickel sulphide. They're not going to go to China for their nickel sulphide, quite obviously. And Australia is in difficulties because the nickel price is too low for them to sustain their operations. So Samsung, I think, is showing the way, but I think that there will be additional off-takers coming to Canada because of the investment of Agnico, Anglo, and Samsung. I would think you'd have people knocking at your door. You've got your BFS, you can have an EIS by the middle of the year. That makes one hell of a difference, doesn't it?
Oh, very definitely. And I would say, we're in over 20 plus active conversations across the battery supply chain, and as well the stainless and alloy supply chain, and I would say some of those people just aren't knocking at this point. They're banging on the door because, for them, 2027, 2028 is just around the corner, in terms of the lead times that the car makers are thinking about. So, as you said, we're in a very enviable position, that, we are, we could be one of the first projects to come online once we get our financing package in place by year end and permits by, about 16, 17 months from now.
But investors who look at the company's website and view these interviews will see that you've got, at the moment, 84 million available to evaluate additional projects as well as advancing Crawford to the stage of financing. I mean, you've already got the BFS for Crawford, so what are you doing now? Are you actually, with that staking program, which very few people noted, you're actually in position to become the dominant player in the Timmins camp for nickel?
Oh, 100%. I mean, the Agnico, who were the back end of a charity flow-through deal that, put $35 million of exploration money that we need to spend this year. We published our first resource on Crawford with just over $4 million of drilling expenditure work. So, the potential here to have $35 million to help unlock the scale of the resource that we have across 20 plus properties. Crawford, on its own in total across all categories is approaching 10 million tons in terms of contained nickel. And with the geophysical footprint that we've got, and we've got a pretty good targeting approach that we've refined over the last 4 years, we're pretty confident that a high proportion of the 25 times the footprint that we have with Crawford is going to be converting into a pretty usable resource, which should put us on track if this potential is realized, to become the world's largest nickel sulphide district.
I actually believe that the Timmins camp will be. But Katrina, the investors don't seem to be latching onto this. And this discussion Mark and I are having, it's quite clear that Canada Nickel is on course to being the leading nickel sulphide project in the Western world. How can it possibly be 290 million capitalisation when, if you take the bankable feasibility study and you add in additional projects which could be in earlier production than Crawford, nobody is seeing this value proposition? What is causing the investors to be switched off? It's Canaccord saying nickel bearish outlook, UBS saying don't do nickel. They're not looking at your nickel. They're looking at the nickel, which is depressed unfairly by nickel laterites with a very bad carbon footprint. What do you think? Where are investors what's going to make them change their mind?
Well, that's a good question, Rod. I think historically institutional investors haven't historically latched onto the nickel story, and one of the main reasons, as Mark outlined earlier, is these headlines coming out of Indonesia, oversupplying the market, displacing North American nickel. But I think this is why Samsung investing in us really validates the investment thesis, and institutional investors are starting to slowly wake up. We've been getting a lot of inbound calls now from institutional investors that previously weren't interested, but now they want to learn more. They want to have an update call. So we are getting more and more institutional investor interest. And also, I mean, for Samsung to make this investment, we are, it just reflects the importance for them. They're an Asian-based battery maker. It's important for them to source clean, green nickel based in North America and not Indonesia. And it's not just us, as Mark had outlined, it's FPX Nickel. They have a similar deposit as ours. It's an ultramafic bulk tonnage deposit, and they now have 3 strategics in their investment story. So they've got, as Mark said, Outokumpu, which is a stainless steel producer. They have Sumitomo Metals and Mining, and an unnamed strategic. So that between them and us, there's 6 strategics here. So I think very, very, this is slowly trickling down to the investment community, and they're starting to wake up and see that these industry players are really leading the way, and we're getting a lot more interest now in the nickel market and in our story.
I think I totally agree with that, but I would also, being a bit sardonic, I think getting Agnico on board and then getting Samsung on board, I think occupied rather a lot of time for you people that you didn't have available, and you weren't able to talk to institutional investors when these things were causing you to be blacked out. But now you've done it. But here's the interesting thing, with 84 million in the bank, you're not under any pressure to take on additional offtakes at anything other than an incredibly attractive price. And your Crawford can be in production for 40 years. It can be a long-term source of supply. Mount Keith in Australia is being closed down because it's been in production 50 years. In your camp, Kidd Creek is approaching the end of its life, which is going to give you the workforce and helps with the infrastructure and gives the possibility of toll milling on an additional project with higher grade, nearer surface material than Crawford. Do you think that's a fair observation, Mark?
Yeah, no, for sure. We really are in an excellent sort of one-off position, to be able to be the supplier in a reasonable time frame. A lot of other people haven't even begun their permitting process, and so to have this kind of head start on all the other operations and the scale. One thing we haven't mentioned yet is when we're fully ramped up, we would be the third largest nickel sulphide operation in the world, and the largest Western world nickel operation going forward, and that's for a 40-year overall mine life. So, again, we're well positioned to become the sort of the big new nickel sulphide supplier to the Western world.
Okay, Mark, but there's a very important point here. To do that, you're doing this with the Crawford project, but you've got 6 other projects. How are you going to be spending shareholders' money for the next 18 months? What are you going to be achieving over that time? Let's give you 2 years, be generous.
No, the three sort of the two key pieces where we'll be spending money and 3 initiatives to get over the goal line. So one is permitting. This is the big spend from a permitting perspective time frame to get that environmental impact statement in place. So that's bucket of money number 1. Number 2 is in terms of detail engineering. You complete your feasibility study that takes the engineering to a certain level, but to be able to order long lead items, to be able to have shovels in the ground as soon as those permits are received, we're going to have to advance the engineering on a number of fronts over the next 16 months while we're waiting for the permits to come. So those are going to be the 2 biggest expenditure areas. And then obviously we want to put the full financing package together for the project, and working with our partners Scotia and Deutsche Bank on the equity and joint venture side, and then with Cutfield Freeman on the project debt side. We're aiming to have that full financing package in place before the end of the year this year. And with those 3 initiatives, we'll make sure we're ready to go by mid next year.
Which means that further off-taker agreements are likely, but not until late in 24.
That's correct. Yeah. We may have some happen sooner, but it'll be most likely end of year.
Right. Well, you're going to be a different company at the end of the year. So when you're looking at $2 billion project, how do you think it'll split up?
Yeah. So typically for projects of this scale, you have a sort of 40-60 equity debt split. From the equity side, we've from the equity side, that $800 million, because there's multiple government programs available at the federal level, the provincial level, even the U.S. Department of Defense, we qualify as a U.S. government ally for that type of funding. We expect a fairly substantial portion of that 800 to come from that group. In terms of offtake partners, along with the Samsung SDI deal, there was $100 million US if they exercise the option that's there, and we expect to have additional equity checks come along with the remaining offtake agreements that are there. And then, again, we've got inbound interest from the typical Asian trading houses, who are keen to take a 10 to 20% project interest. So between those three sources of financing, we're quite comfortable to get the equity check in place. And then on the debt side, again, government agencies are lining up, to be able to help finance critical minerals
You'll get
development.
the equity without any problems when you got all the rest in place, won't you?
Oh, no, exactly. Yeah, no. We're in a really unique time right now where governments are writing checks to see these kinds of projects go forward. So it's great to be able to develop a project, in terms of using shareholders' money when you get free leverage from the governments.
So looking ahead, 1 year and 2 years, I would assume, Katrina, that you are going to be planning an extended marketing trip now that you've got all of these things in place.
Yes, that's right. Actually, we're starting to market as of this week. So between now and April, we'll be attending 5 investor conferences between Toronto, we're going to Cape Town, we'll be in the United States, and then back here for PDAC, as well as Zurich. We'll be doing some marketing. So really covering a lot of different geographies and a diverse institutional investor base as well.
I think you've got a big advantage in that Agnico no way will sell any shares. Anglo American is still in there, and we haven't really highlighted the carbon storage aspect of your business plan, which I think is a very big differentiator, certainly from any nickel laterite project, is that this is virtuous and the government likes it. And Samsung is in a very good position. They're not going to sell, but I think that there will be some contests coming up for you to take on another off-taker, because the off-taker's need is greater than yours. The off-takers have got large manufacturing plants with employees. They have to have the product, and they have to come to you because there isn't anybody else as advanced in an attractive jurisdiction as Ontario.
No, it's a very exciting year ahead, Rod. So yeah, we're off to a good start and very exciting year for Canada Nickel.